Hey everyone, today I want to talk about testing a GraphQL server in .NET. And that's actually a common question that we get, how people should approach that without spinning up the whole web server. So today I will walk you through this. And I will show you a couple of approaches here. The first is just the easiest way to go at it, and then we make our tests more performant as we go. So let's dive in. So this is a typical example that we have when you use the GraphQL template with books and authors. This will be enough to show you how to approach these tests. The second thing here is that we have an XUnit project. So at the moment, there's actually nothing. We just have a class simple tests. Just as a hint, so you don't see any imports here because I offloaded them already here. I tell you what I'm using as we go through this example. And also I will have this example on GitHub. So if you look at the YouTube description, you will find the link to the example. And with that, let's write some tests. So the first test I recommend people always to do, even if you don't test the rest of your GraphQL server, is a simple schema dump test. Let's write this first and then I explain you why it's so good. So in order to write this test, let's create a simple test method here, and the test method should be async. So I'm calling this schema change test because we are using that to express the change that happened to your schema over time. And wait for it, let's first implement it fully to see what it does. So in order to do that, we want to get a schema object that represents our schema, our type system in GraphQL. And to get that, we're gonna await a new service collection. Sounds strange, but actually we are not awaiting the service collection. So we can say add GraphQL server here, and then we essentially add our GraphQL configuration. In this case, we just have a simple query type. So we're gonna add that. And then we have a helper method here, which is called build schema. And this actually inside builds the service provider from the service collection and then creates the schema object and returns us that. Okay, with this in place, we're gonna do a schema snapshot. And I'm using Snapshooter. So if I go here in my CS project, you can see I'm using snapshooter.xUnit. And that's a snapshot tool that you can use. There are others like Verify, for instance, but I'm using Snapshooter. So with that in place, let's take our schema, and on our schema we can say toDocument or toString. toDocument will give you the AST of the schema SDL, so you could traverse it and do changes to it. But we just want to have the string representation of it, and then we do match snapshot. And we're almost done. Let's just add the fact attribute on top of here and then run this thing. Okay, and we are back, and you can see one test passed, and here in the snapshot folder now is a new snapshot file, and that's actually the GraphQL schema representation. So let's put the pieces together. The first thing we're gonna do is make this whole thing a Git repository. So I'm going here, I'm actually opening a new console, and then we're gonna do .NET new git ignore. That's the first thing, so we don't get any binaries into our Git repository. The second thing is we're gonna do git init, and then git add. And last but not least, we're gonna commit this thing to our repository. So now we have no changes and we have an initial commit in our repository. So now let's introduce a change to our schema or to our C# types in the backend. So I'm going here into my server, going to query here, and actually let's introduce a new resolver on our top here. And I'm gonna add a resolver to just fetch the author. With this in place, actually, we fundamentally changed our GraphQL server. And if we run our tests now again, you can see that the test actually fails here. And if we look at the log of the test, we can see that the schema changed at position 153, but that's not of concern. But we see the change actually that was introduced here. So you can see that there is a new field author. And if we look at our folder structure here, then we can see there's a mismatch folder, and that is the new schema, the new snapshot. And that is the old snapshot. And if we think the change is okay, we can just drop that into our snapshot folder here. And then we could rerun our test. And you can see it passes now. The mismatch folder is gone. And so what excites me about this feature actually is that you now have a single commit that shows you the C# change you did And also, if you read the commit, what effect the C# change had on your schema. This is especially nice if you're doing annotation based or code first. So this approach then is called code first or annotation based with schema as an artifact. So you will always have the latest schema checked in your repository. This could also be used for tooling. And you will have with each C# change also the schema effect or the schema impact documented in your Git commit. Okay, that's awesome. That is part one of it. Let's move on to some other tests. So this is a schema test, and I would always do it. A second thing is we want to maybe test some queries. So this is as easy as doing actually this. And in fact, let's copy just this whole thing here and call it, for instance, fetch author. That's the first thing. And we're gonna rewrite that. So in this case, we don't get a schema, we get a result. And instead of building as a schema, we're gonna say execute request async. And then we just add here a query. So in this case, we are digging into the book and just get the author of the book. And last, we want to snapshot that. So we do a result and .toJSON and then match snapshot. And if we run that, we again get our snapshot in here. So we have a new snapshot. We verify that it works. So we look at it. Beautiful. The JSON structure here is the exact JSON structure that you would get when you request the server through HTTP. So that's nice. And let's add another test here just to have some variance in it. So we're gonna copy that again. And now we say fetch book and author, and we're gonna add the title here and then just rerun our test. And you can see how quick you can actually do your test for various queries. And then you just verify that it works, that it looks good, and then you check it in. And also with that, you check in the snapshots here. Every time you change something and that has an effect on your runtime, you will have that documented in your commit. So let's have a look at how fast these tests execute. So we go here to our terminal and then we just do .NET test, and you can see it's executing the test and we are around 40 milliseconds, 39 milliseconds. So it's quite quick. But as you add tests, so we could have here a fetch author 2 maybe, and now we are using another resolver and we're gonna execute that again. And you can see it's quickly adding up. And think about if your schema is large. So Hot Chocolate optimizes for server execution. That means we are building query plans, we are building the schema, we are compiling expressions and things like that. So we are optimizing on every level to have fast execution on the server. And on the server, we actually preserve the executor. In most cases, actually, your schema doesn't change. So we always repeat here in every test our whole schema configuration. And there is actually a better way to do that, to have a single setup or a single component that represents your setup. So the executor is thread safe. It's made for the actual GraphQL server that you deploy to the cloud. So it's made for parallel execution and stuff like that. What we're gonna do is introduce kind of a test helper. So let's maybe create a new static class here and call that test services. So this test services class will help us to execute queries on our GraphQL engine. So the next thing we need to do is initialize our GraphQL engine. And I'm going to use a static constructor here. So we don't have a lot of lock logic that we need to introduce. So we just have here our type initialization logic. And then we need to expose a couple of things. So I will introduce two properties here. One is the service provider. That are all our services that we want to use. The GraphQL services, including any other service that you need to execute queries. Could be the setup of your entity framework and stuff like that. The second thing is that we use a request executor proxy. We have actually a thing that's called iRequest executor, and we're not going to use that. We are using the request executor proxy that will keep state of our executor that we use. And this is actually an internal thing that we ourselves use in our backend. So when things are phased out, that we recompose them without you having to deal with the complexities here. Okay, let's create our service provider first. So we're going to do, I see I forgot an S here, services. So we're going to do services and then say new service collection. And it's actually the thing that we already have up here. So let's grab this part. This is our service setup, and we paste it in here. So this is the GraphQL stuff. We might have some other dependency injection stuff you could chain in before, or you have an extension method where you anyway have your services defined that you need for your server. So with that in place, we're gonna add our proxy. So I'm saying here services, and that breaks actually the chain. So the request builder that we use to chain these GraphQL things exposes the property services, which actually is this service collection. So we can just use that to break the chain. And then we're gonna add our proxy here. That is a singleton. And we have here request proxy. And into this request proxy, we inject the request executor resolver. And since we didn't specify any name here, we could specify a name here. It's the default schema name. So on schema, we have a static property that represents the default schema name. Okay, with this in place, we're gonna build our service provider. And now this property is fully initialized. It's actually good. There's no async logic here. And then we're gonna get our executor here. So executor, okay. So that looks good. And we could already use that. Like we could use this executor now here in our tests. But there's a lot more that you now have to deal with because these executors are written for the backend. There's some logic around them, and I'll walk you through it as we build it. So we should actually create a little helper here that executes our request. Okay, so this is a good base for our method here. So what we're gonna do is we execute something in here, and I have not specified that yet. And then we return a string because we anyway want to snapshot these things. And as an input, we're gonna take an action on a query request builder. So the test that I did up here mostly used just a string, but real tests would involve variables and things like that. So it's good to have a request builder here to have all the possibilities that you need. You could add another overload here that just has a request. So essentially takes the GraphQL string without variables to make it simpler. But this should be our base here. And since some tests you want to also have a cancellation handle, let's just inject here a cancellation token so you are able to abort requests. So the first thing we need to do is actually creating a new service scope. So why is that? When we execute in the backend, we're actually using scoped services. We get a request services object. It's a service provider. It's already scoped by ASP.NET Core. And this is important since the services you inject, like maybe entity framework or things like that, they might be scoped on this request. Also think about if you're using data loader. The data loader's cache is essentially a scoped service. So let's put that in here. First, we're going to do an await, then a var scope. That's our service scope here. And we're going to await using it actually. Because a service scope, the service provider needs to be disposed after we have used it. And then we're going to take our services and just say create async scope. Okay, with this in place, we have our service scope, and then we can actually create our request. For this, we create a request builder here. And then we're going to add our scoped service object to the request builder. So set services. And then we actually apply here the configure request on our request builder. That's all these settings that the test will do. And from that, we create the actual GraphQL request. And you can see the actual GraphQL request is an iQuery request. Okay, let's move on. So next thing we need to do is actually execute that thing. And I'm adding here the executor. So executor execute with the request and the cancellation token. And we need to do an await using on our result here, since the result object is actually a pooled object and we don't want any needless memory pressure. So let's just await using it. Another aspect here is the executor can bind request execution resources to the result object. So this is, for instance, needed if you defer and stream, we would actually have the execution bound here. And the moment you dispose it, you also dispose any async execution that is still running in the background. Okay, with that, we are good. The result is good. We can make one more adjustment because this is just for single execution requests. So queries without defer or mutations without defer. So let's make sure that this is true. And we have a helper method that is called expect query result. So we only want to deal with query results, otherwise it would accept here. And then we just return the JSON result. So we're going to do to JSON and return that thing. So let's have a better look at it. This is our thingy here. And actually it still has some squiggles here because it's not static. Okay, with that, it works actually, and we could try it out. So let's go to our tests here and let's rewrite them to our new test helper here. The snapshot stays the same. So if we execute that, we get the same snapshot. Okay, that worked. Let's go to the next one here. And this guy here is now a result. So we can get rid of this to JSON thingy here and just quickly match on the result. Let's also introduce that down here. I have updated all our tests here. We can run them in a second. Okay, let's see how fast this now executes. We had 59 milliseconds before, and now we have a compile error. Quickly fix that. There's the brace missing. So let's rerun that. Now we are down to 28 milliseconds. And if you even duplicate the tests here, we're duplicating the tests. And let me get rid of the schema test because we don't want to have that multiple times. And rerun that. And you can see that it only costs 7 milliseconds more. So we have duplicated the tests, but we actually don't pay so much more. With the other approach, it was like 10, 12 milliseconds that we added per test. But now we are just paying 7 milliseconds for a test duplication, meaning we're having twice as many tests, but we only pay 7 more milliseconds. So doing this approach will give you a lot more performance in your tests. Okay, last thing here. If you want to test defer and stream or subscription, it becomes a whole lot harder. I will do a follow-up video on this and show you a couple of approaches how to create stable tests when you handle streams of data. Are you already doing tests against your GraphQL layer in your setup? Do you have different approaches than I used in my video? Do you have something unique, new? And are you using snapshot tests? Please sound off in the comments and share your experience in writing tests against the GraphQL layer. If you liked our content, please hit the like and subscribe button below the video. And with that, I see you next time.